We are about halfway through Judges 17 through 21, as we are going to be wrapping up the book of Judges this Wednesday at church at 6:30 p.m. But here in this chapter, in Judges 19, it is just one of those chapters that makes you want to skip it. and don't get me wrong, it's hard to read the stuff that we are about to read. It, I wish I could. I wish I could skip it. But the problem is, if we don't go through the difficult parts of Scripture and reading those, we will miss the part of the message that the Lord is trying to get at. And here in this chapter, I think it's two things. First, that really jump out to me. First is not, it's more of an observation, and it's that the Lord is really barely mentioned in this chapter. There is a mention of his name, um, saying that we are going to the house of the Lord in chapter 19, verse 18. There is a mention of that, but outside of that, that's it. And there's no the Lord speaking, there's no the Lord doing this. I mean, it is just he everybody in Israel is doing what is right in their own eyes, which is what we talked about a little bit earlier with Samson and leading up to the last verse. And it is just this very, very dark chapter, which I think is leading to really the point of this chapter, and it's how dark life would be without the Lord involved, without Jesus involved in your life. How dark it would be. And here it is, we are truly going to see that. Now, does that mean that if that every single person that rejects the Lord or doesn't believe in Jesus is just a complete lunatic and does these murderous things? Of course not. However, this is what is at the depraved heart of humanity. And if we did not have the Lord who gives not only saving grace through Jesus, but common grace as well, it would be terrifying what could happen on a day to day basis. And so, with that, turn to Judges chapter 19. Judges chapter 19, we're going to look at the whole entire chapter here. So, we'll start in verse 1. And it starts very common from what we've been seeing in 17 and 18. In those days, when there was no king in Israel. So that is being repeated and repeated. So, as the reader, you should say, okay, this phrase, there was no king in Israel, is clearly important to this author of this book as the book is being written. So, I need to make sure, not only do I need to remember this, but I need to connect what is this leading to and why is this important. Again, twofold reason. First, if there was a human king in place, then they, with their leadership and their authority, should step in and say, this is crazy. We should not do this. Um, that's number one. Number two is that Israel has forgotten the Lord, and especially forgotten him as their only king. He should be the King of Kings, right? And sadly, that is not the case. So we get to just see that happen over and over again here in 17, 18, and now 19. And I think that is a very big, it makes a lot of sense why we're seeing that over and over again. So let's pick up in verse 1. A certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Now, a lot, some people have thought because it's talking about Levi, it's the same Levi that has been mentioned in chapters 17 and 18. My guess, it is not. And there's a couple of reasons why I'm getting to this. Uh, First, the mention of the Bethlehem of Judah, Bethlehem in Judah, is connected to the concubine and not to the Levite. So that's one thing, whereas the Levite that is mentioned in 17:18 is connected to Bethlehem and Judah. So I think that's one reason why that's a little bit different. And then it's interesting that the Levite is described as certain. A certain Levite was sojourning. I think is meaning to separate this Levite from the Levite of 17 and 18. I think that is probably what that's getting at. Yeah, it's interesting, but is it the same? Most likely no. Verse 2. And his concubine was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there some 4 months. All right, already we see some issues. First off, a concubine in the ancient Near East was a marital companion, but not on the same level as a wife when it comes to legal and cultural significance. A concubine is not seen on the same level. And when we get to Solomon in the book of First Kings, this becomes a big issue because Solomon uh, loves women, let's say, and he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So there is a difference between a wife and a concubine. Some have said that she is just a sexual slave. There is definitely some point to that. However, in ancient Near Eastern culture, a concubine does have a marital companionship in mind with it, but basically it is going against um, God's design of marriage. It is absolutely going against it. And well, with this certain concubine who is not named, she stays anonymous throughout this chapter. Um, she is unfaithful to him. Well, if in one way you say of course she is, because he is not really completely faithful to her, because he is not exactly treating her as his uh, like complete wife, basically. There is, yes, it's a marital companionship, but it's not a complete marriage, basically. And so it kind of makes sense, but at the same time, obviously, it's not great that she is unfaithful either. But this is this is kind of the hard part to read, because on the one hand you want to go, okay, yes, she was unfaithful, but at the other hand, like, this whole relationship is set up to fail to begin with. So really, for me, there's no winner at all in this whole entire situation. There's no winners in this in this whole entire chapter, and it just gets worse from here. And by the end of the chapter, you just feel just so incredibly bad for this woman. I mean, it's just, but we'll get to that in a second. Verse 3. Then her husband arose and went after her. Now, again, with this concubine terminology, there is a marital companionship to it. So to call him her husband is still a valid use of language and use of words. It just doesn't mean the complete definition of husband and what it should have been. It is fractured. And again, in the country of Israel, this should not be. Because they are supposed to be set apart for the glory of the Lord. If that was the case, and they were actually trying to do that, then concubines would not be a thing. But obviously, they are, not just in this chapter, but going to Solomon. And so it just shows the fractured nature of Israel at this point, for sure. Going back to verse 3. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys, and she brought him into her father's house. And when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. Now, when I first read through this chapter, I had this feeling, because there is this back and forth between her dad and this Levite. And I honestly thought that the father-in-law was going to beat this guy's butt. And like, I honestly thought that he was gonna kill him. He was gonna beat the crap out of him. Like, just he was gonna do that. But no, it's strange because he meets him with joy. Again, it just shows you that something is very, very wrong. Because if a father is in this situation, he is most likely, not every time, I'm not going to say that, because that's definitely not the case, but especially a father that is in the Word and knows the Lord and knows Him as Lord, then he should absolutely be trying to figure out what is going on with this situation and should not just be like, "Oh, hey, buddy, how are you? Do you want to grab a couple drinks and eat some food and we'll have a great time?" That should not be the case with this father-in-law, but yet it is, and not just once, but multiple times, as we will see here in a second. So the Levite is in this house with his concubine and with his concubine's father, and they're about to just start chilling, basically. Verse 4. And his father in law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and spent the night there. Three is very, very big number in scripture. It's not surprising to see that here. This is, if you're going to be hosting a guest, in this culture, that is very, very typical that you would have them at least for 3 days, if not more, which is what we'll see here in a second. So this part is very, very normal ish. It's very normal that that would happen where you would invite them in for 3 days. But they ate and they drank and spent the night there. Verse 5. And on the fourth day they arose early in the morning, and he prepped to go. But the girl's father said to his son in law, "Strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go." Again, this is early in the morning, so he is trying to basically, some could have said, "Oh, he's just trying to feed him before he goes." No, I think he's trying to stall, possibly, because of what keeps coming after that. Verse 6. So the two of them sat and ate and drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, "Be pleased to spend the night and let your heart be merry." Um, Verse 7. And when the man rose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him until he spent the night there again. So you have this morsel of bread, which again should not have taken hours. and yet and yet it seems to me that based on the reading of this, that almost the whole entire day is taken up from this morsel of bread. This guy is stalling. The drink that is there, we are not given the specific type of drink, but it would not be surprise me. It would not be surprise me. Whoops. It would not surprise me if alcohol is involved, especially with how constantly he is able to get away with this. Again, it's not. It doesn't say like, and they drank alcohol or and they drank wine or something like that. But it doesn't say that. But my guess that probably is part of it because of the continuous nature of this and how long it takes to do this as well. Uh, well, he tries to get away, by the way, this Levite, and it does not happen. He spends a night again. So now we're getting into the fifth day on in verse 8. And on the fifth day he arose early in the morning to depart. And the girl's father said, strengthen your heart and wait until the day declines. So they ate, both of them. So now we have another morning and another quote unquote breakfast that then lasts throughout the day. But this time he actually does say wait until nighttime. So they eat, they chill, and now it comes to night. Verse 9. And when the man and his concubine and his servant rose up to depart, his father in law, the girl's father, said to him, behold, now the day is waned towards evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to its close. Lodge here and let your heart be merry, and tomorrow you shall arise early in the morning for your journey and go home. Now, again, this is very typical of this culture. You would not, as a host, you would not uh, be, it would be very inhospitable, I think is the right, unhospitable. It would not be hospitable. It would not be hospitable to let a guest, especially if that guest is your son-in-law and your daughter, to leave at nighttime. There is just constant worries about live animals, thieves on the road during the night. Again, there's no flashlights. There's nothing like that. There's definitely no cell phones. So it's a very dangerous thing to do. And so the father-in-law, I believe, thinks that he's got them for another time. Now, before we see what the Levite says, I want to bring up a couple things here. First, again, this is another Levite. He should be in the service to the Lord, and yet he is sojourning and, just like the other one, trying to find a place. But that's not said here, which again is why I think there's a difference between the two. But he is sojourning. There is no uh, call to ministry from what I could see on this Levite's heart and life. And that should not be based on the Mosaic law. So, again, that should send red flags to you as a reader of Scripture and reading through the book of Judges. And so that's one thing. The other thing is, why is this father in law trying to stall? Why is he trying to keep his daughter here? I think there's two reasons. First, I think it's because he is a father and he is just trying to keep an eye on his daughter, maybe. It's possible she told him that she is now a concubine. It's possible that she told him that she was unfaithful to her husband. So maybe he is trying to keep an eye on her to protect her from this quote unquote husband, the Levite. And maybe he's trying to protect her from the Levite because he's worried that as soon as she's not under his observation or supervision, that the Levite's going to attack her, and that's going to be the end of her life. Uh, well, in a way, that's kind of prophetic, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Um, I do personally believe that that's probably what's going on here. The other one is that he is maybe the other theory is that he's just trying to learn more about his son-in-law. Um, it's it's probably very likely that this is the first time they have met, the Levite and the father-in-law. This is probably the first time they met, so that is very, very possible that that could be what is going on. That he's trying to learn about him and his character. Uh, or it could be a combination of the two. Me personally, I do think he is just trying to look after his daughter and trying to be protective of her as well. If she had told him what she is doing and that she was unfaithful to the Levite. That is probably why he keeps trying to do this. But the Levite has finally had enough at this point. So, verse 10. But the man being the Levite, would not spend the night. He rose up and departed and arrived opposite Jebus, that is, Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. Uh, First off, so Jebus or Jebus is probably more likely the pronunciation. Uh, Jebus is another way to say Jerusalem, and basically what's trying to say is that Jerusalem at this point is nowhere near the importance that Jerusalem will have later on in the country of Israel. I think that's probably what they're getting at. Um, yeah, that's my guess. And then, second, he is doing the thing that would also be not wise, and that is traveling at night in this day and age. And in this in this day and age, you should not be doing this. And again, the father in law tried to be hospitable and he tried to not have them travel at night, but it failed. So, is that truly on him? I don't think so. He did his best and he tried. Um, I just think is a failure on the Levite to put himself and his concubine in this situation. And yeah, I think that is really kind of what's going on here. Picking up again in verse 10, or sorry, in verse 11. When they were near Jebus, the day was nearly over, and the servant said to his master, Come now, let us turn aside to the city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it. And his master, so basically at this point, there is a servant with them because verse 12 says, and his master said to him. So the master is um, most likely the Levite. I don't see who else it could be at this point. So I do believe that the master mentioned in verse 12 is probably the Levite that we've been discussing in this chapter. Um, yeah, so with that, picking up again verse 12, and his master said to him, We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah. Um, Again, this is a remarkable statement. Clearly, this means that Jerusalem is definitely nowhere near the importance and the value that it has with Israel as a whole, as it will later on, especially under David, and clearly the Jebusites, which is where the city got its name before it became Jerusalem. Have a very big influence on this place. So it is very I think it makes sense. It makes sense why he is bypassing Jebus or Jerusalem, but going on again is risky, and we'll see why. Verse 13. And he said to his young man, Come and let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or at Ramah. So they passed on and went their way. And the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. The tribe of Benjamin is probably what that's getting at. And they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. All right, so um, they they have decided not to go to Jebus. They are going to either Gibeah or Ramah. So it looks like they decided to go to Gibeah first. Probably was the closer and the one that was on the way of the direction they were going to. Um, Now the he that's mentioned here is very very interesting. And so let's keep reading to see who that is, whether it's the Levite or the servants. So we'll keep reading. But the open square of the city is a very dangerous place to be in. There's no places to hide. There's no places to go, and basically, they have not found any sort of lodging or housing or an inn, something like that, to stay the night in. And so he, being the Levite or the servant, we'll see, is in the square. Verse 16. And behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field at evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was sojourning in Gibeah. It's interesting, right? So you have not just the Levite is sojourning, but you have this old man sojourning from Ephraim as well. So the men of the place were Benjaminites. So why that's mentioned here is one, to clarify that the Benjamin mentioned earlier in verse 14 is the tribe of Benjamin, but also to set up the very dark section that we're about to read is dealing with Israelites. It's not Jebusites. It's not foreigners. It's people of Israel and people that should know the Lord and know His word and know what they should do to obey the Lord and know what they should avoid as well. And yet, what happens. Verse 17. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, Where are you going, and where do you come from? And he said to him, We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to the house of the Lord, but no one has taken me into his house. We have straw and feed for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and your female servant, and the young man with your servants. There is no lack of anything. And the old man said, Peace be to you. I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square. So he brought him into his house and gave the donkeys feed, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. So, a couple things. You've got this conversation that you have the most likely the man that is in the square that the old man finds, or vice versa. That is probably the Levite, and it mentions that because he's from the hill country of Ephraim, which goes all the way back to verse 1. So my guess is that's who that is that we are talking about. So they're having this conversation. They've told them why they're there, the predicament that they're in. It's nighttime. They're in a foreign land. They're in a different city in the country of Israel that they're not really familiar with, and they would love to have some sort of lodging. But with that being said, it's interesting for a couple reasons. First, the phrase at the end of verse 19, there is no lack of anything, that's it's obviously it's somewhat true. The rest of verse 19 shows um, that uh, it shows that they have a lot of the things that they need um, when it comes to feeding the animals, when it comes to feeding themselves. They have all that, but there is no lack of anything. That's not entirely true because they don't have housing, and that's why they're in this open square, the city at night. And so it just makes you go, really? You're not lacking anything, seeing that you have no place to go? It's kind of weird. But then the only mention of the Lord in the whole entire chapter happens here in verse 18, when it's talking about going to the house of the Lord. And it makes you wonder, does he say this because he is a Levite? I don't think so. I think what he is probably trying to do is trying to give off the sense um, of patriotism, because the house of the Lord at this point is not the temple in Jerusalem. Clearly, we just talked about Jebus. It's the tabernacle, and so they're on the way to that. I'm not entirely sure if that is really uh, this genuine this genuine journey, or if it's just like, hey, I'm going towards the house of the Lord, so therefore you should really help me out. Because he does follow that up with the phrase, but no one has taken me into his house. Yeah, that's probably what's going on here. But either way, the old man says, "I will take care of you," and but the phrase "only do not spend the night in the square" should send up red flags everywhere. It should make you go, "What's going to happen and what's wrong?" Uh, Absolutely, that should be what you're thinking about. And now we get to this section. And this section is incredibly dark. Is incredibly dark. It's incredibly hard to read. And so, with that being said, I understand if parts of it you just do not want to hear. Um, I totally get that. I do ask, though, that you try to stay with it, and that you try to understand the difficult aspects of this chapter, because again, it feeds into this idea of how dark um, our world is without Jesus and without the Lord. I really want you to get that picture. So let's dive in to Judges 19, 22 through 30, or the rest of the chapter. All right, let's take a look. Verse 22. As they were making their hearts merry, again, we're not told that this is involving alcohol. However, this would be a very common way to describe those that are getting drunk, those that are doing that. So could it be that they're just having a good old time telling stories? It's possible. It is very, very possible. But most likely, it's probably involving some sort of intoxication. That's what I kind of see from this. But that's not even a fraction of what's going to happen here. Go back to verse 22. As they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him. All right. Now, there's a couple of things here. First off, when we are talking about the men of the city, you have to go back to the description of these men that was given beforehand, almost like a foreshadowing or a forecasting of what's going to happen. In verse 16, the men of the place were Benjaminites. That phrase is now stuck in your mind when you read, "Behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows." Worthless fellows basically means they not only are they up to no good, but they are completely gone from following the Lord, and they are totally fine with whatever they want to do. And it doesn't matter if it's disobeying the Lord or not. They're going to do it because it's right in their eyes, which is a big part of the end of the book of Judges. Not just there is no king in Israel, but also, and they did what was right in their own eyes. So that is a big part of that. So they surround the house, they start beating on the door. The old man comes to the door and they basically say, "Bring out the man who came into your house." That man is, again, probably the Levite. It would be a little bit bizarre if it was the servant, especially knowing that he is going to be, the old man is going to mention his concubine in verse 24. So most likely they are talking about the Levite. Now, the phrase, "that we may know him," at the end of verse 22, this is referencing sexual relations. It is not a we want to sit down with him and we want to have a Q&A survey. We want to see where he's from and where he's going and what he's doing. What does he do for work, and what are his great childhood memories? How did he meet his concubine? They don't want to hear all of that. That would be that we may know about him. But the Hebrew word here for know is absolutely the same as the Hebrew word for know when it comes to sexual relations. And so they are asking to have um, homosexual sex with this Levite. Now, when it comes to this specifically, a couple things. This should absolutely make you go back to the book of Genesis and connect this with Sodom and Gomorrah. It should absolutely do that. This is very much the same circumstance that we see with the angels of the Lord being housed by Lot, the nephew of Abraham. And Abraham tries to offer up his own daughters to keep the angels of the Lord protected under his house. Now, we'll get to that in a second because it is the exact same. This is absolutely to make you connect those two things. And here's why I think this is. I think that the Lord is trying to get across that no matter if you have this long line of ancestors or family members that know and believe in me as Lord, that does not matter for your own spiritual state and for your own relationship with the Lord. Just because your ancestors or your family, as we would more likely say, just because they believe in the Lord or they believe in Jesus, then that doesn't mean that you're just good. Like, you're in the club too. No, that's not what it means. And here, I think what he's trying to say is just as those in Sodom and Gomorrah were acting in this manner because they have refused me as Lord, even those with the ancestry and the heritage and the and the history that Israel has, even those folks with all of that can fall short in a manner that looks the exact same as those that completely refuse the Lord from day one. Their family completely refuse the Lord as well. I think that connection is absolutely to be made here. And as I talked about, and if you would like to go back on our channel, and I made a two-part video on Sodom and Gomorrah, because Sodom and Gomorrah is not just about homosexuality. Was that part of it? Absolutely. And that is part of what's going on here. And so that is a sin based on what the Lord has said in the scripture. And that is really true here as well. Now, there is also more going on to that when it comes to a failure in hospitality, a failure in parenting, a failure in the failure in marriage, specifically here, when it comes to the Levite and his concubine. So that's not just one thing, but that doesn't mean that homosexuality is not part of this either. It is a part of this. It is a part of this very dark section in Judges 19. So that is definitely a part of what's going on. But then, of course, there's more to it, and we're about to see that. Verse 23. And the man, the master of the house, the old man, went out to them and said to them, No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. And before I read this next sentence, because it's honestly, it's 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 awful. Um, the old man is right to say what he says in verse 23, at least to start. No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. What he should have followed that statement up with is that do not act so wickedly because the Lord has told us not to do so. That's exactly what he should have said, but he fails to do so. Could it be because he doesn't know? It's very, very possible. Um, and so he wants to be a good host. He's trying to be hospitable. He's trying to protect his guest, the Levite, but then he fails in that protection because he offers up the Levite's concubine. It's awful. It's just, but we have to finish verse 24. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Violate them, and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing. It's just, it's horrifying to read. And it's horrifying to think about. Not only that this is in Scripture, but the fact that somebody who should know better and is in Israel and is a part of God's people is even thinking about doing this is awful. Just as it was bad when Lot did it or suggested it in the book of Genesis, it's equally as bad here, if not worse, because it's it's his daughter, but he's also offering up the concubine of his guest. I mean, it's just, and you would think that the Levite man would say, well, hold on a second. That's my concubine. Like, why are you offering her up? That's not, well, one, that's awful. Uh, that's not fair. Like, I'm her protector. Like, don't do this. There's no mention of that whatsoever. Um, he doesn't protect her. He doesn't mention. There is no mention that the Levite man tries to uh, tries to go tries to step in and help, to the point where they wouldn't have to put these women out of the house into the arms of just these horrifying men, these horrible men as well. But it's just it's a very, very terrifying thing. Well, verse 25. But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them. Again, this is interesting when it comes to who is the man. So the man seized his concubine. It could be read that the old man seized his, meaning the Levite's concubine. However, I think it's more likely that the Levite man seized his concubine and made her go out to them. It's just, it's terrifying to read, and it's terrifying to think about. And of course, it gets worse. And they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. Again, new here is not sitting down, going over a Q&A, getting to know about her. They had sexual relations with her. But it was rape. At the end of the day, that's what it is. And they abused her all night long. And then they just let her go. And at least on the surface, it doesn't look like there's going to be any justice for this poor woman. But then again, it gets worse. Verse 26. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. Now, did you see the change of language here when it comes to their relationship? It's really interesting. Again, in a terrifying manner. The change in the relationship happens after this ultimate failure on his part. He does not stand up as a man. He does not stand up as a husband. He does not stand up as somebody who should know better because he is not just from Israel, but he's from the line of Levi. And he fails in utter regard to everything. And yet at the end, there's this switch. And no longer is he her husband, or he is the Levite man. He is now her master. And I think what the author is trying to get at here is that the breakdown of this relationship and now just this horrible crime is solely on him. I think absolutely it's on him. Now, obviously, it's on the men of the city too. Don't get me wrong. Like, it's definitely on this men of the city as well. But this guy is acting like a heathen. He's acting like a pagan, and he's acting like a master instead of a husband. And that is a very, very important and valuable observation to the change in this language. That's important to see. Verse 27, and her master rose up in the morning. Again, just giving this idea that just so much has failed here, and it continues to fail. And when he opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. Ooh, okay, a couple things here. When it says he went to go on his way, I believe this absolutely means he was going to leave her there. If she was off to the side, or if she was behind the house, or if she was not even close to the house, he would have just left her and gone. I absolutely believe that's the case here. He would have just gone on his way, because that's what it says. And he sees her lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. What that means is when you're thinking of the door of your house or your apartment or your condo, wherever you're staying, your front door, the threshold is that space where the sidewalk and your door meet, and then that space from where your door is inside of your front door. That's where that threshold is. And so her hands are literally there at the door. Could it mean that then she was scratching at the door? I think so. And it's just this terrifying picture. And I'm not surprised that he reacts the way that he does. Verse 28. He said to her, get up, let us be going. But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home. Get up, let us be going. Seriously? But then not only that, but there's no answer, which basically means she's dead. That's what that means. And there's no care in the world, at least from, there's no emotional response, there's no grieving. Now, what he's about to do, some would say is a form of grief. I don't believe so at all, by the way. We'll get to that in a second. But he just goes. And this is a Levite, somebody that is supposed to be called, or his family line is supposed to be called to do ministry. But again, it's not just because your ancestors are called to something. Does that mean that every single person is called to it? They don't have to go into ministry, but they do it. Do they have the opportunity to go into ministry? Yes, they do. They are given that chance to do that. And so, again, that's what it should be. But obviously, that's not the case anymore. Because a Levite can just go wherever he wants, whether it be 1718, where he's just going to a place, or in 19, he's just sojourning with his concubine. And not only that, but he's a complete jerk as well, obviously. But again, it gets worse. Verse 29. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, again, who's dead, he divided her, limb by limb, into 12 pieces, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. It's mind-boggling to me that this could even happen when it comes to the history of what the Lord has done for the people of Israel. But again, these people have constantly just turned their back on the Lord, not only disobeying him, but betraying the Lord time and time and time again. And finally, the Lord had enough. And this is what will happen if the Lord had enough with everybody on earth, this is what would happen. And it would be on a more grand scale in a terrifying manner. Now, the 12 pieces. Again, it's terrifying to say. Why does he do this? Because of verse 30. And all who saw it said, such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak. Why do I think the Levi man did this? It was to stir the pot of the emotions of the Israelites to go after these people. Now, we could talk all day about if he is right to be looking for revenge, so to speak. I don't believe he is at all. Again, yes, the men of the city, the worthless fellows, as they're described, absolutely had a huge part to play in this crime. They are not at fault, or they're not. They are not. They are not innocent at all. Sorry about that. My screen went black. They are not innocent at all. But neither is the Levite. And for him to think that, oh, well, I'm doing this to send a message that this isn't right and we should get revenge on these people. Okay, but you're the one that put her in this situation in the first place. It's just awful. And it's sad as well to see in verse 30 that those who saw these 12 pieces bring up their own history of coming up out of the land of Egypt, and there's no credit to the Lord for that, by the way. No credit whatsoever. Again, it shows you the darkness that is there. Now, here's where we'll end, because again, the main point. Sorry if I'm again, it's hard to read. It's hard to read that section. The main point of this chapter is to show the darkness in our hearts that really comes out if we just refuse the Lord and reject him. This is what comes out. Again, it's not going to look the same for everybody. I'm not saying that every single person is going to go out and do this. But when you have refused and rejected the Lord time and time and time again, do not be surprised if he gives you what you want. Don't be surprised if that happens. Now, to end this, there's a very important question to ask. Why didn't the Lord step in and do something with all this just horrifying stuff in verses 22 through 30, and still horrifying stuff throughout the whole chapter? Why didn't he step in and do something? It's a great question. It honestly is. And I think it solely comes down to how we view the Lord and how we view grace. Yes, God is the God of grace. In my mind, he's given so much grace so far in this book alone. Time and time and time again. Throughout this book, we've talked about the cycle. Time and time and time again, they just do what is evil in the Lord. The Lord tries to discipline them. They kind of get the message. He sends them a deliverer or a judge, and there is peace after the judge delivers them. And then as soon as the judge dies, or a little bit after the judge dies, the cycle starts again. And they start disobeying the Lord, and they start following after different gods and goddesses, or betraying the Lord. And It's just time and time and time again. But we talk about the Lord having unconditional grace, right? So why didn't the Lord step in? Well, because God is the God of justice as much as he's the God of grace. And in my mind, the fact that he is a God of justice is a good thing. If you had only a God of grace that just forgives every single thing that anybody does, even if they don't believe in him, then who is he? He's kind of a wimp. At the end of the day, that's what the Lord would be if he just forgave everybody, no matter if they believed in him or not. If he just forgave everybody of everything that they did and everybody gets to go to heaven, no. No. Because God's standard is perfection, because he is perfect. And not only that, but because God is the God of justice. Now, don't get me wrong, the opposite is true as well, and I'm glad that God is not just the God of justice, whereas whether you are refusing him or if you are believing in him and the Lord is just, nope, I'm not going to forgive anybody anything. Nope, no, 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 no. That would be terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. So I'm glad that he's not that either. But I'm also glad that he's not just a God of grace all the time. It's our God is God of justice and of grace, and that combination makes him great and makes him worthy to be praised and worthy to be worshiped and worthy to be followed and worthy to be obeyed. It and when we don't come to see him as that, that's where the darkness of sin comes in. So, yes, in my mind, I would love it if the Lord showed up right in the middle of that court square and said, "Hey, let me stand up for you," and instead of you having put the women out of the house to be raped. And what's interesting is there's no more mention of the daughter, by the way. It's just the concubine. I think that's interesting. I didn't mention on that earlier, but I do find that again terrifying. But that is interesting that there's no mention of the old man's daughter um, after he offers her up. There's no mention that she actually um, was sent out. It just talks about the concubine, and so, uh, anyways, just wanted to point that out. But yes, it would be obvious that we would love it if the Lord stepped in. But again, this is to show what happens if you and I are just left to our own devices, and and what happens when we just constantly reject the Lord. And so, if you are watching this and you do not know Jesus as Savior, this is the darkness that is waiting for you. Again, this I'm not saying that you're going to commit these crimes. I'm not saying that at all. But you are destined to go to a place called hell. And in hell, you will be there for eternity with no relief. It is just going to be pain and suffering for eternity. But thankfully, we do have a God of grace who is a God of justice, and that's why those who reject him and refuse him will spend an eternity in hell because God is a God of justice. But because he's also a God of grace, he has given you a way to escape being in uh, being destined to hell. And instead, you will spend eternity with him in a place called heaven. And more importantly, you will spend eternity in his presence, where there will be no pain, no suffering, no death. It's a beautiful picture. And I hope you make that decision to follow after Jesus. And if you would like to know how, um, I'm sure there are plenty of videos on our channel, but a quick summary is to just say, Lord, I know the darkness of my heart and of my mind and of my life, and I am sorry for those things. I'm sorry for disobeying you, but I've heard about Jesus, your son, who came to live a perfect life and died in order to put my sins into the grave. And then 3 days later, after he was buried, Jesus rose from the dead to proclaim victory over sin and death and to give me the opportunity to spend eternity with you in heaven. And Lord, in this moment, I make that decision to trust and believe in Jesus as Savior and Lord. And I want you to mean those words. Not just say them and then go about your day with no change whatsoever. I want you to really, really mean them, to give up on the dissatisfaction of your life uh, without Jesus, and instead be in awe of your life, of your new life that you will have as a son or daughter of the King. And and what a beautiful, beautiful decision that is. And then from there, surround yourself with brothers and sisters in Christ who know Jesus as Savior, which is basically what a local church is. Surround yourself with them, and they will help you grow in your relationship with Jesus. That is really what it's all about. And I hope that you make that decision today, because without Jesus, it is a terrifying, it is a terrifying existence, and it is it's a very dark life, not just here without Jesus, but I'm talking specifically about eternity. And so, with that being said, thank you for spending a little bit of time here with me today. I know it was dark and I know it was hard to read, especially that last section in verses 22 through 30. But I thank you for walking through this passage with me. And as we'll see in Judges 20, there is a level of justice that is coming for the worthless fellows, the men of the city. There is a justice coming for them. Now, how it comes about, we will need to discuss and we'll need to talk about it. But there is a justice coming for these worthless fellows, so to speak. Um, but we'll get into that tomorrow, or Monday, December 16th. We'll get into that. But thank you for spending a little bit of time with me today. I will see you tomorrow as we dive into Judges chapter 20 and walk through that chapter. Thanks.